I think it's a very critical time in our nation. And I'm sure you have been watching the events that have unfolded. And we don't really poll people. I'm not going to poll them this morning. I'm sure even in a smaller group as this is, or a larger group, you'll find a wide diversity of opinions and perspectives and appreciation and lack of appreciation. But our nation is in great turmoil. There is great divisiveness that's at work in our nation, and it's strong. And I heard one quote that was something to the effect, when passions run deep, in essence, be careful. And passions have run deep, are running deep, will continue to run deep in our nation. I'm telling you. And so, and I think that's a picture, an image of what's going on. We in our own lives, as a pastor, I feel one of the greatest, I went to a family reunion, 4 years ago, 5 years ago. Faye goes every year. And there was a young man there that just caught my attention. And I was just interested in striking up meaningful conversation with him. And so I asked him, I said, okay, I don't know how old he was. I'll say he was in his early 30s. I said, what is the greatest accomplishment of your life so far? Realizing you're still a young man. And he told me, wow, I don't know. That's a good question. I'd never been asked that question. And in the end, he explained he had a full-time job and he was going to school full-time, and it was 2 or 3 years, something like that. Now you're talking about endurance. If it was 2 or 3 weeks, you could talk about patience. But he said it was 2 or 3 years that I was full-time student, full-time had a full-time job. He was married, and I don't know if they had their little girl at that point in time or not, but I know he was married. And he said, I think the greatest accomplishment of my life so far was that I made it through that time period. I stayed employed at his place of employment. I finished my degree and was able to then make the next step that I wanted to make. I was wanting him to ask me what I thought the greatest accomplishment of my life up to then was, and I didn't really know how to answer him, because I thought, oh my goodness, there are so many wonderful things that I've been privileged to be a part of. He never did ask. And the next year, I think I went the next year, and I was hoping, expecting he was going to ask me that. And I think, no, he never did ask me. And I think the greatest accomplishment of my life up to that point in time, let's say up to then, it would be hard to say, but I would have said, I don't know. Boy, there's 2 or 3 or 4. And they all just seem to rank up there. But I would say one of them was God called me to build a house. And that house was an incredible journey. And after the house was up, we ran out of money. I ran out of a job. We ran out of everything. And the church I was going to, I just came to realize they're going down a different path. I know it's hard to believe for me even to say these words, but they were talking about if you really, if Jesus was Lord of your life, what you would do is you would let him have the title of your house and car, but your house for sure, to prove to him. And so the only way you can really do that is that you should turn the title of your house over to your pastor. And that way you can prove to Jesus. And Faye and I said, we're going to exit now. That's the end. So at that time, those were our relationships. They were everything. And people were told, don't associate with Russ and Faye Porcella. Don't fellowship with them. Don't associate. He's building a house. Don't help. I don't know all the words that were said, but I had no more help. And it was Faye and I and Heather, and she was just little. And I told you, Faye tried to nail one 8-penny nail. That's about that size. It's not a big mama. It's about that size. And she took 32 hits on one 8-penny nail, trying to drive in a piece of plywood on the subfloor. And I said, honey, how about you chase the nails that I miss, and I'll nail. And we didn't have power guns, air guns, and those things at that point in time. And so we had nobody to help. So we had no money. We had no job. We had nobody to help. And we live in that house. And everybody who sees it says, oh, it's a nice house. It's a nice house. This is to the glory of God. It was furnished, finished, and paid for by God. A lot of hard work, a lot of sweat, a lot of building by ourselves. Because our relationships were all shut down in one instant, in one point of time. And we kept at it. And we built by ourselves. And we built by ourselves. It's hard building by yourself. It's hard raising walls by yourself. Oh, Faye's dad helped. Faye's grandfather came and helped for a while, and then he died. He was helping me. He was going to start on our kitchen, and he died. And he died in our bed after we put the deck on the front porch. So he'd built many houses, so I was relying on Grandpa, and he died in my bed. I was so offended. I didn't listen to the Lord. He died in my bed. I was offended. He died in my bed. And I tried for about 45 minutes to raise him from the dead. And I don't know all the motives in my heart, but he died, and it was in my bed, and I needed his help, and it was offensive to me. And I heard this very still small voice on the inside of me that was saying, minister to the living. It was just the faintest voice, minister to the living. And when I finally did come in contact with that and heard it, I just pushed it aside. No, I'm trying to raise him from the dead. And so it was Faye and Grandma and I in the house. And Grandma, her husband had died. Willie, the love of her life, her husband, and Faye, her grandfather. And I'm telling you, I just kept going for it. And I kept hearing this voice, minister to the living. And it seemed to get louder, or I gave it more attention. I don't know for sure which was it. But eventually, it stopped me. It caught my attention. I said, okay, I'm going to minister to the living. I didn't like that. It wasn't my intention to leave him dead in bed. I needed him. I'm not sure my motives were pure in any dimension, any way, shape, or form. And so now, our money was gone, our job was gone, our friends were gone, Grandpa was gone, dying in my own bed. And I believe that, and had a Bible verse. And so there's this verse, if you could put it on the screen. I don't know, it may be on the screen. Romans 1:17, this is the point of the message. For it is the righteousness of God, for in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith, as it is written, the just shall live by faith. Now, if you're living by faith, then your actions and your words will reveal it. And your actions and your words will express it. James, the book of James says, faith without works is dead. Romans says, we believe with our heart and we confess with our mouth. It's the word of faith. It's believed in our heart. It's confessed with our mouth. So if you take all the dimensions, your heart has to be involved. It's something that you actually believe with your heart. And your actions reflect your obedience. You obey it. You acknowledge it. You live in the light of it. Your actions are dictated by it. And your mouth becomes involved. I believe when we're young, God does so many things sovereignly. Just as you do so many things parentally when you have a young baby. You do everything. It's like every whim that the child has. I know it may be flavored by how many other kids there may be in the house, but just about every whim, you just jump. You're ready to do, and you're ready to trigger. What do you want? You want a drink? You want food? You want your binky? Well, you want to be rocked? What do you want? Because I'm going to fulfill it right now. There comes a point in time when you anticipate, expect, teach, and maturity comes along. You make your own bed. You take care of your chores. You live by the decision that you make. When we're real young, it's our parents make almost all the decisions for us. And we, the children, reap the benefit of it. We reap the good of it, we reap the bad of it. But at that point in time, I would have said the greatest accomplishment is that I accepted the grace. I obeyed when the promptings of God came. I wish I could tell you I obeyed instantly when I gave away my table saw. I told you that weeks ago. No, God had to come at me 3 times. To minister to the living. No, God had to speak that to me multiple times. I was going to raise Grandpa from the dead. Those were difficult times. We are talking about not patience then, as I mentioned last week. We're really, the main topic is we are looking at Romans 12:12. To rejoice in hope, to be patient in tribulation, and to remain steadfast in prayer. We're on the middle one, patient in tribulation. And I tried to express last week, patience can have such a shallow meaning in our vocabulary. It doesn't have to be shallow, but it's so commonly used in very shallow dimensions so much. I gave a number of examples last week. But in context, it's patient in tribulation. And the picture that gives, and I may or may not, it all depends, I may or may not. Actually, the New Testament has a lot to say about patience and endurance and steadfastness. It's shocking how much it has to say. It is a part of our lives, especially as we get older. And I would have said at that point in time, one of the major accomplishments of my life is I kept my eyes on the Lord long enough. Now, I would never have said I kept my eyes on the Lord all the time, and I always did what he was prompting me to do. I did it enough that I was available. I was still obeying what he wanted me to do. It was extremely difficult. And we live in it now, paid for. No borrowed money. We live in it. To the glory of God. And there was a 2-year time period when I wouldn't even go up on the property, and it was the shell of the house was built. Now I believe at the end of my life, I believe the greatest accomplishment will be I kept pastoring a group of people who stayed with. They stayed with the promises and the hope, and they kept rejoicing in the hope that they believed that God had placed before them. And they were patient in tribulation. And I mean by that, they didn't quit. They stayed with what God wanted them, the pressure. And we are talking about, let's just sort of make it clear. We're talking about the end time global harvest. We're talking about one of the absolute final acts of the grand symphony until we move into the tribulation and the 1,000-year reign of Christ. Obviously, that's another whole symphony. And I'm not talking about that. But this whole thing is going to end with the gospel preached to every nation as a sign, as a witness. We are not talking about a light thing. And we are talking about the role of nations playing the role that God had given to them. And I believe that God has given us ample evidence, ample confirmation that a shock to the world, he is going to use Russia. And my guesses are that when that moment finally arises, it probably will be close to that. It will be so far from being credulous that Russia, there's going to be an all-encompassing national spiritual awakening. We tend to like to see it building and building and building and building, and it's easier and easier and easier and easier and easier to believe because it's building and building and building and building. The cross wasn't that way. It got harder and harder and harder and harder, and the opposition got more and more and more and more. To where in the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus was praying, and it was such pressure that drops of blood were coming out of his forehead. And it wasn't a question was Jesus was again trying to say, he never had to deal with it, and he wasn't then. Am I going to do your will? It seems clear from the text, is there another way? If there's another way, let it happen. But nevertheless, your will be done. I interpret that Jesus, in essence, was saying, I'm going to do it the way that you choose. I think in the unstated things, it could have been, I know what's ahead. And what's behind is nothing compared to what's ahead of me now in a week, in a few days. It doesn't even compare to what's ahead. Is there another way? But he endured the cross, despising the shame, ignoring. The Amplified adds the term, the understanding. He ignored the shame, despising the shame. It was like, I just despise you, shame. I'm not going to give you any voice. I'm not going to give you any place in my life. You're not going to have any authority, any rulership. I despise you. He ignored it, so to speak. Despising, ignoring the shame. Now, in the New Testament, that concept, that sense, who he endured the cross, which is the vocabulary of the New King James Version, the version I've chosen to use most of the time, is that I did what you wanted me to do to try and guide a people to believe for the impossible, to believe for the absolutely impossible, and to stay engaged, and to stay rejoicing in the hope, and enduring, and staying constant, remaining constant, steadfast, remaining steadfast in prayer, keeping with the prayer assignment, remaining steadfast, Romans 12:12. That as a pastor, I did what I should have done as a pastor, to guide a people in what would have been the absolute darkest, most difficult hours. By faith. If one of my intentions is to read several of the passages in the New Testament that talk about enduring, because it is my conviction you will not endure if you are the focus. Great song, Jesus, you're the center. If you are the center, if your person is the center, if your reputation is the center, if your self-centeredness is the center, then you won't make it if what you are called to do is something that God has called you to do, that's going to take for you to keep your eyes on Jesus. If you are the center, we will not make it. We are not talking about a light thing. And you have to obey. Do I have to make it happen? No, you do not have to make it happen. But you do have to act in faith. The just shall live by faith. So along the way, and the older you get, it should be the bigger the assignments, the bigger the responsibilities get, the more, just like your kids, you're grown now. It's up to you. You will live with your decisions. We, as a body of Christ, as Christians, it is the just shall live by faith. To me, faith calls for obedience. Faith calls for action. Faith has a voice. Faith has a heart that's to be protected. If you were at a point in time when you listened to any music that's on the radio, and you could care less, you could listen to any station with will, it doesn't make any difference to you what it is, you're corrupting your heart. If you can watch anything that's on TV or any movie, you could say this weekend, I'm going to go to the movies. Well, I don't know. I'm just going to roll some dice, and whatever number comes up, I'm going to number them all, and I'm going to go to that number. Well, what if it's a raunchy movie? I don't care. I'm going to roll the dice, and you're corrupting your heart. And it's with your heart. In the parable of the sower that Jesus said, it's a noble and a good heart, and brings forth fruit with patience. In the New King James Version, it's a noble, which means it's a virtuous. It's a virtuous, it's a heart. And good heart. And brings forth fruit with patience. So the seed is planted in the heart. The heart is so important. You have to live by faith. It is not our responsibility to make it happen. If it is our responsibility to make it happen, then it's dependent upon us completely. And then it will be a human-sized task. If only God can accomplish it, but he's looking for people to follow him, to honor him. He's looking for faith. That means he's looking, if we're walking in faith, if you, in your own life, in whatever it is, if you're walking in faith, then it's going to show in your obedience to the Lord. It's going to show in your actions. It's going to show in your words. It's going to show. Otherwise, you're living a very person-centered life. You're living a very yourself-centered life, and that won't work. And sometimes God picks some of the most unusual time periods in which you have to, in essence, make a decision. Are you still in? When Grandpa died in our home, he was to be buried and was buried up in Michigan. So we did all the things that you do and tended and shipped his body up there and went up for the funeral. Now, grant you, we were at the place where we'd run out, in essence, we'd run out of money, we'd run out of friends, we'd run out of everything, run out of a job, we'd run out of everything. And Grandpa died. He designed my roof. He helped me put the roof trusses on. He designed it. I was counting on. He was a cabinet maker. I was counting on him. So we went to Michigan, and we had nothing. And I believe at that time I'd lost my job, and I didn't know what to do. And we stayed, where they lived when they were up in Michigan was kind of a campground, and there were some really nice homes in that campground, and we stayed in the upstairs, not attic, but upstairs area, and it happened to be a library in a house that was next door to where Grandma and Grandpa's cabin was. And Faye and I, they put a bed, rolled a bed, a roll-away bed or something in what amounted to the study. And as I went to sleep that night or as I woke up in the morning, my eyes were directed. Why were your eyes directed to one of the shelves, the end of the shelf, because it was the very end, and it wasn't a solid bookshelf, it was kind of like a metal thing, so there was a lot showing. I saw the title of the book, the end book, and it was Feed My Sheep. That's what the title was, Feed My Sheep. And I looked at that, Feed my sheep. Now, those are the three words that God spoke to me when he called me, and I was just beginning a PhD program, and he spoke to me in audible that I sat up in bed and told God just spoke to me. What did he say? He said, feed my sheep. And I automatically defined it, but it doesn't mean be a pastor. I'm not going to be a pastor. I had heard that pastors were people who couldn't make it in any other profession in life, and so they turned out to be a pastor. So I wasn't going to be a pastor. All of that's erroneous. I'm telling you, if you make it as a pastor, that's tall cotton. If you make it well, do you understand? If you make it well. And God let me have 7 years. That's a whole story in of itself. I don't know why he did that. He let me have 7 years. I came to this, I don't want to teach biology. And 2 years later, that was 5 years into it, and 2 years later, I don't want to do research. I want to work with people. And so there I am at the funeral, Grandpa's funeral, and at the end of the bookshelf, I see, feed my sheep. Now it's the second time, 7 years have gone by. Now, why was that book there? I don't know. There could have been 200, 300, 400 books up there in that room, that library. Why was that book the end book? I know. There's this angel named Fred, and he's a book arranging angel. And God told him at some point in time, now, Fred, rearrange the books so that book is on the end, because Russ is going to be there, And he needs to see that. And we'll see what he does, but he needs to see it. So we're going to put it there. We're going to put it there so he can come in contact with it. In essence, what he does with it, he's going to have to live by faith. He's going to have to walk by faith. But it's the next step along the way. But if he'll do it, if he'll do that, it's the answer he's looking for. He doesn't know it's the answer he's looking for. He's going to have to say yes, when in the natural, it's almost like there's no good reason to say yes. I'm going to stick with, God, what you have for me. I'm going to stick with your purposes, your intentions, your job, your location, there's no end to it. I'm not just talking, though I am meaning in a large measure this congregation. There's nothing that you are doing in life, because you should be doing the will of the Lord. You should be doing what he's told you to do. That's what you should be doing. I'm just saying, if you talk about endurance, I have found, there do come time periods in your life when every natural reason thing you have to depend on is gone. Now what are you going to do? I remember Kenneth Hagin's classic quote of a story he told. A deacon asked him when everything collapsed during the time period that he was pastoring years ago, and he said, well, we're going to act like the Bible's true. That was his answer. We're going to act like the Bible's true. Feed my sheep, the book said. I pointed out to Faye. See, God knew what was coming. I looked at that. Feed my sheep. I don't know all the things I said. I pointed it out to Faye. It was a major We go back home. We're sitting in our living room. This is why I believe there's a sovereign God. He is looking for people who will live by faith. I didn't mean to touch that. If you could have it go back for me. He's looking for a people who will live by faith. I do not believe if it's what God wants, it will happen. I don't believe that. I hope you don't. I hope you don't live under that misconception that if it's what God wants, he'll make it happen, regardless of me, regardless of what actions I choose, regardless of what decisions I make, he will make it happen. People say that in regard to life. It's the Lord's will. It will happen. So they come to the conclusion, if it happens, it is the Lord's will. No, there's a devil who's going about seeking whom he may destroy. And we are told to first and foremost submit to God, but we are also told to resist the devil, and he will flee from you. We are told to do both. First and foremost. So we get home from our trip to Michigan, and we're sitting down in our living room. Now, I know what happens. This is what happened. Fred was put on assignment. That's my imaginary angel. Do I really believe there's an angel named Fred? Probably. Probably. Do you understand? There's Fred 1, Fred 2, Fred 3, Fred 4. There could be a trillion Freds. Do you understand? But there's this. But what I believe is that God could it be the Holy Spirit in someone's spirit? Of course it could. Do I believe God could send an angel to whisper in someone's ear? Of course I do. Do I believe it's our job, my job, to figure out exactly what exactly happened? No. But how does God communicate? We know that the Holy Spirit bears witness with our spirit. We know that angels are messengers. So here's what happened. We're all sitting in our home in Knoxville, Tennessee, not in our house that we're built, but we were across the street in a little apartment that we were living in at that time, still on Tolson Lane, and we're sitting in the living room, little living room, and there's several people because Faye's parents were there. You know, we had just come back, and they lived, I think, in Blairsville, Georgia at that time, and they were going to stay for a little bit, and then they were going back to their home in Blairsville, Georgia, and over in Maryville, Tennessee, in Maryville, there's a guy by the name of David Morton. David Morton, the salt of the earth Morton. And David Morton is over there. He's just sort of fiddling around. And God had released Fred. It's time. Now's the time. And so Fred went to David and just whispered to him, do you remember that I talked to you about, why don't you invite, he called me Brother Porcella. Why don't you call Brother Porcella on the phone and ask if he'll come out and teach in your Thursday night Bible study in the railroad car that is parked on your skeet gun, shotgun, shoot those clay things, on your skeet gun range, and ask if he'll come on Thursday nights and he'll teach the word in your, it was a railroad car, a real box car, not finished or anything, the big doors, bugs, trillions of bugs, big bugs, big bugs. And call him right now. You got to do it right now. Now, he didn't know that right now, meanwhile, I like movies that try and show you, while this was going on over here. So right now, when David was getting Fred, this may have been Fred the 59th, or 56. This was Fred number 56. And Fred number 56 is right now. David, call him. Call Russ Porcella right now and do what you've been thinking about. And right now I'm sitting in my living room back in Tolson Lane. We had just got back from the funeral. And the thought crosses my mind, I saw that book and it said, Feed My Sheep. And I was thinking about that book that said, Feed My Sheep. And ring, 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 the phone rings. And I answer the phone, hi, and he said, this is Brother Russ, this is David Morton. Hi, David. He said, I have a question to ask you. Okay? He said, I wonder if you'll teach at my Bible study on Thursday nights. And I said, I will. And he acted like, you will? I said, I will. And I said, you probably want me to pray about it, but it's a long story, David. But I don't need to pray about it because I've already heard from the Lord. And, you know, David could go like this. He's back over here in Maryville. He's already heard from the Lord? How could he have already heard from the Lord? That's why don't live life where you're the center. And it all revolves around you. And if it's going to happen, it's because you make it happen. You don't make it happen. You can't make it happen. But you have to obey. And you have to live by faith. If you're living by faith, then you believe with your heart, but you will say it, you will confess with your mouth. You will obey. I'll tell you sometime, David, but yes, I'll be glad to do it. When do you want me to start? And that was the avenue that God gave me, the resources every week, phenomenal amount of unreal amount of resources, $200, $300, $400, one time $500 for an hour and a half of teaching. It was unreal, and this was years ago. This was in the 70s, years ago. God knew what he had planned, but he was looking for something. He was looking for faith. And if he sees faith, he's going to see action. In some dimension, there's going to be action. Well, you didn't have action when you heard that voice inside of you when you saw Faye and said, that's the girl I'm going to marry. I certainly did. I didn't know I should speak it. I didn't have a clue that I should speak it. Nobody said anything to me about, you got to talk. Your mouth, so much is available to you in your, but I obeyed it. Okay, I said, if that's the girl I'm going to marry, I guess I better get to know her, so I'm going to watch her. I know some of you say I stalked her. I understand, but you're wrong. I didn't stalk her, but I watched her. I watched her for a year. One time I walked past her, and she was standing at the mailbox talking to her girlfriend, and Faye happened to say to her girlfriend, there's nobody here at Bryan College for me, meaning she was talking about a potential husband. And she said, and I happened to be walking by. I always tuned in Faye. Whenever I got near Faye, I tuned in Faye. So as I walked by her and I heard her say, there's nobody here for me, I did say, but it was very quietly. I think there are moments when God will honor quiet faith, but it was obedience And I said, oh, yes, there is. Just turn around. I didn't say that out loud. Oh, yes, there is. Just turn around. And I kept on walking. The just shall live by faith. And if somebody says to you, if you really do everything that God wants you to do, that he's called you to do, and if Jesus is your Lord, and you're depending on him to help you make it, his journey was a phenomenal journey of unbelievable impact. But his journey was a phenomenal journey of opposition, of persecution, of eventually death, though the devil never had it figured out that that was the whole intention, so that he could die in his spotlessness. He could die for all of humanity, past, present, and future. That you're going to mirror that in some dimension of your life. It's going to be mirrored. You have to live by faith. And the three things that I believe that God has shown us is, I have Romans 12, is that it'll call for, and I've talked about this, because of the way it came, because of the confirmations. And last week I just gave you the briefest, and I'm going to have to let that stand, other than that the events that we lived, including that trip, until when we went on vacation some 4 or 5 months later, the events where we lived mirrored Romans 12:12. We made available to 1,100 pastors the prophetic calling on Russia, the end-time prophetic calling that they're still waiting for. We're still waiting for. Somebody to believe, somebody to call for it. God's chosen us among, I don't know who else, to rejoice in that hope. But the only way you're going to be able to do that is you're going to have to be patient in tribulation. Now, tribulation means pressure, and patient is not the pressure that you're dealing with when you're at a stoplight and it takes a longer time, and then the person in front of you is still texting, and they're redoing their mortgage on their house on their cell phone while they're waiting at the light. And so you are running out of patience because you have to go wherever you have to go in a huge hurry. That is not what's being talked about here. That wasn't the imagery of the videos that I saw over the next approximate 6 weeks to 2 months, where each one of those, in essence, there was always one or two, but in essence, nobody believed. Nobody believed the U.S. hockey team would beat the Soviets, except the coach. Nobody believed. Nobody believed that horse, after 1 year, after breaking its leg, would win the Breeders' Cup the next year. But it did. Nobody believed that a caddy would win the U.S. Open and play one of the greatest golfers, European English golfers of all time. Nobody believed. That just is not going to happen, and it happened. Nobody believed that Texas Western would go, they lost one game, and would beat Kentucky for the NCAA finals, and the coach, Don Haskins, played all black players. It was the first time in history that all black players played for Texas. It was Texas Western, and won the NCAA and changed basketball forever. And nobody believed. Now that was kind of the crucible in which it was formed in me. God's going to ask me to do something. Almost nobody's going to believe it. They just won't believe it. They're going to say it's impossible. Well, it's getting to the time period that, boy, it sure does look impossible. If you're wanting to look at something that looks impossible, the world is like spinning out of control. We're just moving to a perfect time for a global revival. Tribulation, patient in your own life, in your own walk. When you have run into pressure, patient, endurance. I've talked about that. Rejoicing in hope, my version, stay focused, patient in tribulation, don't quit, continuing steadfastly in prayer. You must keep praying. And Hebrews 12:2, I'm going to pass that, go to this. Therefore, that was the single verse that I used last time. Therefore, we also, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, I think that means hundreds of things. Two obvious ones are we have before us that the Bible reveals to us a great cloud of witnesses who ran their race. Some of them ran real well. Some of them ran, they had good times and bad times. Some of them ran real well at the end. There were all kinds of examples to stir us. We have all those examples. There's this great cloud of witnesses that have gone on before us. So we can, because we have the scriptures, because we have the inerrant testimony of God of what happened, we have that to encourage us, to stimulate us, to keep going. As well as, in some dimension, I believe they are at some way aware, at least there's more than a clear hint in the book of Revelation, that people in heaven know what's going on at some level in the earth. They know what has happened, what hasn't had happened to some degree on the earth, as well as there's all kinds of stories that are circulating about people and trips to heaven that they make and things that they know and don't know. I won't even add them in. I think at some level that great cloud of witnesses, to some degree, that the picture, the imagery is like the Olympics for them back there, and here's all these witnesses, and they're cheering, and they're verbalizing, and so on. So do I think people in heaven are praying? Certainly I do. Do I think that makes an impact? Of course I think it makes an impact. It means many things. I'm not saying that's the Alpha and Omega on it. Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside. So here's what we have to begin to do. Witnesses. Those were witnesses of, they did what the Lord had called them to do. They did the Lord's work. Not compared to anybody else. You can't do that. I know. I've spent so many years doing that. You can't do that. You, in your own individual journey, for you, in your own calling, the things God's called you to do, you have to lay aside every weight and the sin that so easily besets you. And the non-sin but just consumes you. Whatever it is you could say there is absolutely nothing wrong. There is absolutely nothing wrong with putting siding on my house. Yep, but you put siding on 2 years ago. I know. And you put 25-year siding on. I know. But I just want to change the color. And so I don't like that color anymore. I'm going to put a different color. It will take you weeks to put the siding on, maybe months. Yeah, I know, but I want to change the color of the siding. Would I call that a sin? I know we could get into, well, it's a sin, but it's the weight, what so easily besets you. And I put that in the category, it's an okay thing, but it consumes you. So that you aren't available to run with endurance the race that's been chosen for you. You have to lay aside the weight and the sin that so easily besets you. I think God helps you as you go along. I think he begins to treat you, and he may even discipline you if you're not being very consistent in laying aside the weight and the sin that so easily besets you. Because he wants you to succeed. He created us for a purpose. He wants you to fulfill the purposes that he had for you. He absolutely wants you to. He's made you. Lay aside the weight and the sin that so easily besets, and run with patience, endurance. This word is not the exact same word that's found in Romans 12:12. It is a derivative of that word. The word that's found in Romans 12:12 is the parent word. This is a child word, so to speak. Greek scholars would hate to hear me say that, but it's a derivative of the word. If you read the words, and it's like, oh yeah, I can see how that word came out of this word, because it's kind of mostly the same. It looks the same. It's spelled mostly the same, but it's got a little extra character here or two. It's derived from it. The parent word is the word that means, in most instances in the New Testament, endure. So reading out of the New King James Version, and the sin which leads to be, and let us run with endurance the race. That pictures, it's a whole different kind of race. Run with endurance, the race that is set before us. I interpret that the race is chosen by our Creator who made us and fashioned us. And so our personality is perfect for the race we've been chosen for. Our background, whether we know it or not, would agree with it or not, our background, God knows the kinds of backgrounds, what we're going to experience, what's going to happen to us, what's not going to happen to us. And let us run with endurance the race that is set before us. Looking unto Jesus, so you can't be the sinner. Looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross. That is the word that's used in Romans 12:12. He endured the cross. It's translated this way because patience, even as it's used today, it just would be so inappropriate. It doesn't even begin to. So you could say, Russ, are you saying that there, in my walk following God, I'll come to time periods that it might feel to me like it seemed for Jesus proportional? Yes, you won't be about to pay the penalty for all the sins of all humanity. So no, it won't be identical. You can't even come close. But for you and your calling and your life and what God's called you to, it will feel to you the same. Though it won't come anywhere near it. But to you, it will feel like that in your own life, in your own setting, in your own personality, in your own gift mix. It will seem that way. Yes. He endured the cross. He had to ignore. He had to, in essence, the shame that it feels like. He had to, in essence, despise the shame. Meaning, it has no control over me. The shame that's coming my way, coming his way, it has nothing. It has no voice. Ignoring the shame, and is set down at the right hand of the throne of God. What you have awaiting you if you fulfill the purposes of God is the honor that God intended for you in all eternity. And I'm going to tell you, it's going to far outweigh. We can't even use the words to express it. It's going to far outweigh the prices that you paid here. There's no comparison. He's lavish. For consider him. So what's the number one way to endure? If you're doing what the Lord has called you to do. I'm not talking about if you're going your own way and you're giving yourself over to a life of independence, self-centeredness, and my pleasure. Then you're talking about something completely different. For consider him who endured such hostility from sinners against himself, lest you become, when you're at the place where you really need to walk in endurance, you're going to deal with weariness. And you're going to deal with the potential discouragement in your souls. It's going to be so deep that you're going to be discouraged. You have the potential to deal with discouragement that just rocks your soul. And the answer is, that's given so clearly here, is understand, I'm talking about you're in the race that you're convinced that God has called you to. That's how it works. If you're in your own race, doing your own thing, then the mercy of God help you. But if you're in the race that has been set before you, then the answer is not, everything's going to work out okay and it's going to automatically happen. No. It's going to take faith. Did Jesus express faith on the cross? I'm totally convinced. He quoted the Psalms that were the Psalms of the Messianic Psalms of the suffering Savior. And he ended with, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. His last declaration, forgive them, because they don't know what they're doing. He covered all the bases. He died in faith. In all the promises that had been given. He knew what his assignment was, the race that was given to him. If you're doing what God has called you to do, and it's a biggie, it's a huge one, then you are going to deal with tribulation, pressure. And I believe we were promised there's going to be pressure. There is going to be phenomenal hope. There is going to be phenomenal pressure. There is a requirement, and that is to remain steadfast in prayer. Could we have done a better job praying these past 12, 13 years since that point in time? Of course we could. And you have to learn from the past. So if you'll bow your heads with me.